The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question to the United States is what's in our national interest.
My name is John, and the International Criminal Court is back in session. Today is St. Paddy's Day, March 17, 2024, and a couple days ago was the 13th anniversary of the start of the bloodiest conflict of the 21st century. And it's not the Russo-Ukrainian War. It was this war, the Syrian Civil War, which started in March 2011, and technically, as of right now, it is still ongoing, though in reality, most of the fighting has come to a halt, though I am aware that there is still some skirmishes here and there within the Syrian desert, but also in northern Syria too, and I guess within the Idlib province. But otherwise, the Syrian conflict is effectively dead, and I don't see a solution for this war coming anytime soon. I mean, as long as the United States and Turkey are occupying parts of Syria, which would be here, here, and here, I don't see this war ending anytime soon. But anyway, I wanted to do like a retrospective because there's a lot of people who are just getting into the geopolitics side of things since 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. And to tell you the truth, people, this war, which you're all seeing like right now, like on the screen, like the front lines, like right now, I've been following this war literally ever since it started. Literally, I remember when it all began. It was literally when I was in 6th grade of middle school. So literally my first year of middle school in the United States. The protests were going on around the Middle East, especially in Egypt, Libya, Yemen, wherever. And then you had Syria. Apparently some teenagers, I think they were a group of like male kids or something, boys. They spray painted some stuff on walls calling for Bashar al-Assad to step down from power. And then those kids got arrested, and rumor has it that they were tortured by the Syrian secret police. And all hell broke loose. Basically, you started seeing protests across the country. Not just in Dara, but you saw protests in Damascus, in Homs, in Hama, Idlib, Aleppo, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, you name it. You started seeing protests across the whole, Syrian state. And the protests at first seemed like they had good intentions, okay? It seemed like all they wanted was just a massive overhaul to their system, for Assad to resign from power, and for democracy to take hold in the country. But then something just went terribly wrong. Now, you could argue that this was all of Assad's fault because he allegedly ordered the firing on all the protesters and such in the cities in Syria. I mean, people can point the fingers at whoever they want, but the reality is something went horribly wrong, and the war itself begun basically in 2012. You then had groups such as the Free Syrian Army forming, and then you saw Assad allowing all these terrorists to get out of jail, and then they formed their own little groups such as Ahrar al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, Suqour al-Sham, you name it, and Jaish al-Islam is too. So basically, you started seeing all these armed militia groups ranging from, secular, democratic, fighters to hardcore, radical Islamic fundamentalists challenging the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad, or the Assad regime, as some people would like to call it. And as you all expect from a Middle Eastern war, it got ugly really, really fast. And within a year or so, suicide bombings were a common thing in Syria, which was literally hard a thing to imagine if you were there at that time. Because literally right next door, like to the east, was Iraq. Like Iraq's war was just literally wrapping up. The United States was packing up its things. Osama bin Laden had been killed. I mean, everything seemed like it was going to get better. But oh my, it did not. And then, yeah, the war breaks out. Then you started seeing these guys taking up territory, especially in Damascus. Though the real hardcore, like the real center battles, like were all in Homs and Aleppo, okay? They were like the epic centers of the entire war. Almost everything else was sort of like disregarded because the Syrian army and its troops were all deployed in Aleppo, Homs, and Damascus. And I guess Dara too, but man, they were caught off guard by all of these militia groups. So much so that they literally lost half control of the whole country at some point. I mean, it was bad for the Assad government. It was really bad. And yeah, I remember literally back in the day on YouTube, the site used to be a little more lax with the war, like combat footage. Like literally back in the day, during 2012 to like 2014, you could find like footage of the Syrian Civil War, rather be in English or in Arabic, and YouTube would not take it down or not age restrict it. It was a very different era on the platform back then, and I kind of miss it because people wanted to know what was going on. You had people that were following on the war because they either had relatives or I don't know. They may have been fascinated by this conflict for other reasons whatsoever. I mean, everybody had their reasons. It was huge. So, yeah, I also remember watching Syrian Civil War footage on LiveLeak as well, which is no longer around anymore because, as all of you know, the site sort of cucked itself down after people, I guess the feds got mad at them for posting the uncensored video of James Foley, an American journalist, getting beheaded by ISIS, which led to their shutdown, or started the end of their site, like the beginning of the end of their site. But yeah, I remember literally when the war was basically easy to just search up on YouTube. You had all of these Arabic nasheeds just playing in the background, sort of like Islamic music playing while you saw like Syrian army vehicles get blown up along with all the soldiers in it. I mean, it was a grotesque horror film. That's what the Syrian Civil War was. It was hard to watch for so many people that were unfortunate enough to observe this war. It was really hard to watch. But yeah, so the Syrian rebel groups, al-Nusra Front, FSA, Awar al-Sham, etc., they were advancing across the country, and at their peak, they actually almost took over the entire city of Aleppo. They took over the eastern chunks of the city. They took over most of the Idlib province. They took over most of the northern Aleppo province too. Then they took over Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and most of Hasaka easily. I mean, literally, they were just catwalking throughout the entire country. And then, after they took over El Raqqa in 2013, something began to happen that would change the war forever. Okay? So, somewhere around this time, there was a group from Iraq, who I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, that later just came out of nowhere. It was ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or slash al-Sham. I mean, they mean the same thing, by the way. Al-Sham, the Levant, it's the same thing. Just in different languages. But basically, ISIS or Daesh showed up in 2013, and they were growing in numbers. Though they weren't really a full-fledged force yet, but they were on the rise. And at that time, they still controlled by proxy the al-Nusra Front. But then, in late 2013 to early 2014, ISIS and al-Nusra Front had a huge dispute over the future of their organizations. ISIS wanted to gobble up al-Nusra Front and all of their territories in Syria. But al-Nusra Front, though, wanted to pledge allegiance to al-Qaeda and to remain autonomous of ISIS. Like, they wanted to just go at it alone because they felt that this whole idea of a global caliphate, global jihad was just absolutely bonkers. I mean, they had their reasons, like very good reasons for not wanting to be a part of it. But ISIS was like, nope, you're joining us, rather if you like it or not. And then what happened was, in 2014, basically the first half of 2014, ISIS betrayed al-Nusra Front. They backstabbed them and stole all their territory in northeastern Syria. They took Raqqa, they took Deir ez-Zor, they took most of Hasaka. Then they took basically the areas bordering Turkey. ISIS literally easily crushed the rebels into al-Nusra Front. And the only place where ISIS was not able to prevail was in Aleppo City and the Idlib province. Those were the only parts of Syria where ISIS was not able to reign supreme. But otherwise, though, they controlled majority of the rebel-held areas in the country, or like areas that the rebels took initially, but then they hijacked them. And then you started seeing a mass defection of all these Free Syrian Army / al-Nusra Front fighters to ISIS. And then ISIS basically just bloomed into this giant octopus that eventually then spilled over into Syria. I mean, into Iraq, sorry. My mistake. But basically what happened was ISIS then decided, you know what? Fuck it. Iraq is in a very bad state too. Let's gobble up as much of it as we can. And who knows, maybe we might be able to make this thing come true, this caliphate. So yeah, they took Fallujah, which was the site of an infamous battle in 2004. Then they took Mosul in summer. Then they took Crete. They took Baji, which is like home to the largest oil field in the entire, oil refinery in the entire Iraq. And then they took Tel Afar. They took, they almost took Kirkuk, sorry. I think they also took the Abu Ghraib prison too. That place was pretty infamous back in the day. And then they also took, let's see here. Can I find it on the map? Oh yeah, Hawija. They took Hawija too. That was a big one. But yeah, ISIS basically was just steamrolling across Iraq and Syria. And the United States, which was actually funding the rebel groups that later became ISIS, or parts of ISIS, the U.S. panicked. And they realized, uh-oh, we fucked up. Now we gotta clean up this mess. But in retrospective, though, the United States didn't really do anything to counter the threat of ISIS until one particular event, and that was in late 2015 when Russia intervened in the Syrian Civil War. Now, back in the day, the Russians were dealing with ISIS territory that was going all the way down to Damascus. And they went as far as Sueda, okay? And they even had some chunks of the Quneitra and Dara provinces too, which was right next to the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. ISIS was also not that far from Aleppo City too. They were very close. I think they were either in the industrial sector or right outside it, but they were very dangerously close to Aleppo City. And then they were in control of Al-Bab, which is one of the big major suburbs of Aleppo too. It was an outright disaster. And the United States didn't do jack to stop it. And then in 2015 or so, it was really 14 to 16 when the peak of all this shit was going on. ISIS suddenly came out of nowhere and attacked France. They attacked the Bataclan Theater, gunned down hundreds of people while they were attending a rock concert. And then somewhere in the future, they then decided to also massacre some innocent people in the city of Nice, though I cannot find it on the map. My apologies. Oh, wait, there it is. And then they struck a Christmas festival in Berlin. They then struck Brussels. like at their local airport, and they struck Manchester during an Ariana Grande concert. I mean, people, it's obvious what I'm trying to say here. Something went terribly, terribly wrong. And it all originates back to this war. But yeah, as I said a minute or two ago, the United States, through Timber Sycamore, backed the Syrian opposition militia groups, who some of them were aligned with ISIS. And because of this, ISIS took their weapons and their money too. And then they, within their base in El Raqqa, they then used it like basically as a place to plan their attacks against Europe. And especially they also attacked Istanbul and Ankara, by the way. I mean, again, as I said, it was an absolute disaster. So, but yeah, ISIS was in control over most of Syria, basically like 2/4 of it at their peak. But then, as I said, the Russians intervened in the war to save the Assad regime from falling. And then what happened was, it was basically the beginning of the end of the whole rebellion against the Syrian government. So what happened was, basically, they cleared out Palmyra, though eventually ISIS got it back in late 2016. And then they managed to finally recapture the entire city of Aleppo from the Syrian rebel groups. And despite rebranding itself as Fatah al-Sham, al-Nusra Front was not getting off of the terror list anytime soon. They were later designated as a terrorist group in 2012. And also they were responsible for a massive suicide bombing in October 2012 too. And it killed hundreds of people. And yeah, that must have earned them the spot on the terrorist designated list. Basically, list of groups who the United States saw as terrorists. And they were a part of Al-Qaeda, too. So that didn't help. And a lot of those guys, by the way, praised 9/11 and the hijackers that did 9/11. So, yeah, that was not very good OPSEC, if you ask me. Or good optics. But yeah, so Aleppo was taken. And years prior, Homs was also taken back, too, from the rebel groups. And then in 2017, the United States, I mean, even though we were already getting serious about taking down ISIS, I mean, Kobani was basically where they were completely halted. I mean, God knows what would have happened if they had taken Kobani, but thank goodness they didn't, and they got pushed back. But what happened was, ever since 2016 or so, ISIS started losing all their territory. But it was 2017 that delivered the fatal blow to the group. The Syrian army went on a huge wow offensive across most of the central and southern areas of the country. They retook all the areas that ISIS controlled within Hama, within Aleppo, within El Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and of course the Homs province, and Damascus too. And then but the biggest blow to the group, though, was when they lost Deir ez-Zor. I mean, people could talk about how bad of a blow it was to lose El Raqqa, but I would disagree with those people, because Deir ez-Zor was literally like under siege by ISIS from summer 2014 when the rebels got routed out of there, and the Syrian army was only able to get supplies via like the air. Like, it was the only way the Syrian army was able to keep whatever they still had within Deir ez-Zor, like, I don't know, under their control. But trust me, if you had seen this siege back in the day, you would have been freaking out as hell, because how could anybody survive a siege like this? Especially when you're under siege by the most dangerous terrorist group in probably the history of the world. I mean, I don't know how the Syrian army did it, but they held out for 3 years, and eventually in September 2017, the Syrian army garrisons from other parts of the country, especially like Palmyra, all arrived, and they lifted the siege. And then, for the next 2 months or so, they cleared out ISIS from the city, and then they retook the entire right bank of the Euphrates River in Deir ez-Zor Governorate. So right now, the Syrian army, as of this video, controls 52%, even though it looks like 50, but in reality, it's 52% because the Syrian army controls most of the major population centers. Not just Deir ez-Zor city, but they also control Al Mayadeen. They control Abu Kamal. They control, let's see here. They control, oh yes, that's right, like the suburbs too of Deir ez-Zor. And also, they control like a tiny spot of the left bank Euphrates River, but that's about it. It's basically all on hold. It's like a confusing quagmire down there in Deir ez-Zor Governorate. The United States government, by the way, has like troops deployed in this area here in Hasaka and Deir ez-Zor, and to this day they're still refusing to leave, even though I think they should leave, because ISIS is mostly vanquished, and the Syrian army can virtually handle these guys all by themselves. Like, there's no need for us to be there, okay? I literally don't see a reason for us to stick by in Syria. And also, Turkey is in Syria too. They first got involved on a large scale in 2016 when they invaded North Aleppo to basically rout ISIS away from their border. And they actually took al-Bab, and this is a big one. This was like one of the big urban centers that ISIS held under their control. And then what happened was they got kicked out of there by not just Turkey, but the militia groups that were under their control too. And then you had them starting Olive Branch in 2017, 2018. They took Afrin from the YPG, Syrian Democratic Forces, which are all majority Kurdish people. And then you had them starting Operation Peace Spring in late 2019, and they kicked out the SDF from certain parts of the border. So now they control these areas here, from Tel Abad all the way up to, let's see, basically Ras Al Ain. But yeah, so after this, the Syrian army actually took the initiative, and they advanced into Raqqa, Aleppo, and certain parts of Hasaka. And now the Syrian army and the Russians are now at the border with Turkey, and the United States, despite their best efforts, have not been able to kick the Syrian government out. So, now that I got all that out of the way, let's talk about like the final sort of phases of the war so far, okay? So basically what happened was after 2019, the Syrian army had basically retaken control by literally everything had been back under their control. They took back Dara, which was fought hard for in 2018, and Quneitra, which is a part of Golan Heights that they still control. They then took the suburbs of Damascus, which caused the United States to throw a tantrum and strike them in spring 2018, even though the United States claimed, oh no, it wasn't a tantrum. They had chemical weapons and they were using them on their own people, so we had to do something about it. I don't believe that. I think U.S. was genuinely throwing a tantrum, like a sore loser tantrum, about no longer being able to kick out the Assad government from power. I genuinely believe that's what actually happened. And then they got kicked out from northern Homs, and then they got expelled from most of Hama. And now we come to sort of the elephant in the room, and that is the Idlib Governorate, or the Idlib Province. So, as of today's video, the Syrian government controls around 55% of the Idlib Province. This includes the cities of Marat al-Numan, Khan Shaykhun, Kafr Nabil, Sarakib, Abu Ador, and yeah, that's pretty much about it. Now, certain parts of Idlib are still under the control, especially the provincial capital, Idlib city itself. Ariha, Sarmin, Jaysar al-Shagor, they are all still under Islamist control as of today. And they're getting backing from Turkey, too. So, the Turkish military is all based in these areas. They're protecting them from a Syrian army assault. And then you have the Russians also deployed in the Aleppo province, not far from Manbij. And then you have Russian troops also in al-Raqqa. And then the Americans, we're all in al-Hasaka and in Deir ez-Zor. So if you want to take like the Russian occupation by any sort of like, or any like Russian bases to account, basically the Syrian government has retaken control over majority of the country, like 2/3, okay? So if the Syrian government is like basically like being held by the Russians, they effectively now have retaken control of Raqqa, like most of Raqqa, the Aleppo province, and I guess, yes, certain parts of, I guess, Deir ez-Zor too. But yeah, my mistake. My bad. But yeah, basically, yeah, the U.S. is still here. I literally don't know why. They claim it's to counter Iran and ISIS, but we all know what the real reason is. The United States doesn't want to admit it has lost its proxy war in Syria, and Turkey is also refusing to leave because Erdogan has a huge ego. He wanted to get rid of Assad, and he was like one of the main backers of the Syrian rebel militia groups that were all Islamic fundamentalists. And it's clear now that they have all lost the war, and Erdogan does not want to withdraw the troops because, for one, he thinks Assad, I guess, is still aligned with the Kurdish militias that are part of the SDF or the YPG, which he accuses of being the PKK. And also, again, as I said, he's mad that he didn't win this proxy war. Like, he's mad he lost. So now he's refusing to pull anybody out. And I guess the only way that this conflict is going to end, in my opinion, is if Russia wins the Russo-Ukrainian war, which I do think will start a major shift in geopolitics as a whole. That's literally the only way I see this thing ending, is if Russia wins the war in Ukraine. Because if they win the war in Ukraine, then Syria is probably going to come to an end almost immediately after. That's how big of a game geopolitics is. It's not just like one country. It's multiple countries. And unfortunately, Syria was a victim of its geography, its location, and its crappy neighbors like Iraq and Turkey. And also Israel, too, who occupied Golan Heights. But yeah, the Syrian Civil War is 13 years old, and I definitely don't see it ending anytime soon. But as I said, I think if Russia wins the Russo-Ukrainian war, then we'll definitely start seeing more negotiations between maybe the Syrian government and Turkey, maybe get pushed up, I guess, a notch. But also, another thing to consider, and another thing I want to point out about like the coverage of the war, I remember Twitter not really caring too much about this conflict. Now, as all of you know, we have a lot of Ukraine fanboy, like bandwagoners who are now just getting into geopolitics, but there's a very good chance that they don't know about the Syrian Civil War. And I would argue that the Syrian Civil War was the prototype, sort of like the foundational, like stepping stone to the Russo-Ukrainian War, which is what we see now. Like a lot of toys got tested out in Syria, and the ones that I definitely knew that were not going to do well in Ukraine were, for example, the Leopard. I knew the Leopard was going to fail in Ukraine for the same reason it failed in Syria. The West just simply got cocky, and they didn't increase its armor, and they also just failed to understand that the tank is just not really suitable for this type of warfare. It just isn't. But yeah, the NAFO guys will also nowadays try to say, "Yo, fuck Bashar," but they're not really serious about the Syrian war. They don't really give a shit about it. It's literally just a bunch of like Muslims killing each other, and I bet deep down that's what they really like to see, because a lot of those guys are also tuning into the war between Israel and the Palestinians, and a lot of these guys are all cheering on Zion, which is my nickname for Israel, and it's fucking sick. They're sick people, and I highly recommend, if you have a Twitter or X account, to block these people and to report them for basically their fucking hate speech and bigotry. I don't care if they're liberals. They're closeted racists in my book. But yeah. So yeah, folks, that's going to do it for today's video. So tell me in the comment section below about your memories of the Syrian Civil War, and do you think it will ever come to an end someday? Personally, for me, I don't think so. At least in the short term, but in the long term, I think it could. But right now, no. I just don't see it. But anyway, I hope all of you guys have a great day, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye. Peace out.